So again, hi everybody, welcome. I'm Victoria Van Heining from the Center for Archival Futures at the University of Maryland in College Park. CAFE was established in 2021 as a group of interdisciplinary researchers from the College of Information and beyond. And our work intersects the archives and digital curation very broadly conceived. We're interested in the systems, processes, and institutions that care for and enable the use of digital objects and data over time. The various projects that fall under CAFE's umbrella take a wide range of human-centered approaches to understanding topics including data and communities, knowledge ecosystems, and the life cycles of data. The speaker series that we're kicking off today is our flagship event. It's typically held on the first Wednesday of each month during the semester. And we host speakers who are at the cutting edge of archives and digital curation research and practice in a wide variety of institutions. And you can find our recordings of previous events at the CAFE event page link, which I hope a colleague of mine will drop in the chat shortly. Today we're beaming in from College Park, Maryland, which is located on the ancestral territories of the Piscataway, Nacotchtank, and their indigenous kin and neighbors. As members of the University of Maryland, we acknowledge as a land-grant university the 202,000 acres of stolen indigenous land taken and distributed to the university under the Morrill Act of 1862. We acknowledge the separation that these and many other acts of colonialism, assimilation, and genocide, which include archival collecting, generated between indigenous peoples and their homelands. We honor the continued power and resilience of indigenous communities and nations, and celebrate the collaborative and decolonizing work now taking place in our collections and institutions. We further acknowledge the University of Maryland's connections to slavery and to generations of racialized trauma rooted in this institution. As a member college of universities studying slavery, USS, the University of Maryland has undertaken the 1856 project, committed to investigating and illuminating these histories. The 1856 project endeavors to lay a path toward restorative history, allowing for the institution to engage in the work of moral accountability and reconciliation. Through this work, the University of Maryland recommits itself to creating equitable, inclusive, and diverse curricula and spaces. These legacies of slavery and genocide are reflected in the disproportionately high rates of incarceration of people of color in the US. Of the nearly 2 million people incarcerated in the US at the end of 2022, it was estimated that 32% of sentenced federal and state prisoners were Black, 31% were white, 23% were Latino, 2% were American Indian or Alaska Native, and 1% were Asian or Pacific Islander. And I want to credit Tracy Hall, former executive director of ALA. She included those numbers at the end of the new standards for library services for the incarcerated or detained, which I'll share a slide about in a moment. If you know anything about the American census or our population, those numbers should give you pause. This is Prison Banned Books Week, a time when we raise awareness about the profound destructiveness of censorship in carceral contexts and advocate for better information access. As information professionals and advocates, we all have a role to play in countering censorship. And we'll drop some links in the chat for resources designed to help you do just that in a little bit. So I said briefly just now and flashed the cover, the physical copy of the standards that the American Library Association supported over the last few years, now available in print, and it will be available online at the end of the month. The development and distribution of this new version of the standards is made possible through the Mellon Foundation funded Expanding Information Access for Incarcerated People grant project, which is a collaboration between San Francisco Public Library and the American Library Association. I had the privilege of working on these standards with an amazing team of formerly incarcerated people, current prison librarians, and educators. And the standards mark ALA's commitment to support library services for incarcerated people and indeed people when they're released. The standards include guidance on effective library services inside a variety of institutions, including juvenile detentions, jails, and prisons, as well as practical examples of model services. And I will provide some information in the chat about how you can request a free copy. So it's through that work that I had the enormous pleasure of meeting Doran, who's going to be speaking with us today. I want to give a brief introduction before handing over to Professor Lawson to tell us about his work. So Professor Lawson is the Edward North Professor of Literature at Hamilton College. He led a writing workshop inside Attica Correctional Facility from 2006 to 2016. He's the founding organizer of the AA Granting Attica Genesee Teaching Project and of the award-winning AA degree granting Hamilton Herkimer College and Prison Program at Mohawk and Mid-State Correctional Facilities. He's the author of Witness in the Era of Mass Incarceration, Discovering the Ethical Prison, that came out in 2017, and the editor of Fourth City, Essays from the Prison in America in 2015, the largest print collection to date of nonfiction essays by currently incarcerated people writing about their experiences inside. He founded and now co-directs the American Prison Writing Archive, which he'll tell us about today in his talk titled Archiving the Crisis: What Urgency Should Archivists Feel Regarding Living Archives of State-Sponsored Violence? Finally, Doran's new book, Inside Knowledge: Incarcerated People on the Failures of the American Prison, was published by NYU Press in January of this year, 2024. Doran, thank you so much for being with us today. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Victoria. And also thanks to CAFE and University of Maryland College of Information, and of course the ALA. The comments, I'm going to keep them relatively brief. Oops, sorry about that. Because I want to leave lots of time for questions and answers. So before I start, I'm going to give a history of the archive because I think origins matter, particularly in this case. I've been talking about the APWA and focused, of course, on a living archive, as we call it, work by currently incarcerated people. But I hope you'll find that it applies broadly to social justice archives more broadly. So I'm going to try to share a screen here and get this lined up properly. Let's see. Now do that. Let's see if that's working. Does that look good to you?
Yep, that looks good.
Okay. All right. So I included in the first slide a quote from Jimmy Santiago Varga. Language gave me the way to keep the chaos of prison at bay and prevent it from devouring me. And I'm not going to have time to deal with exactly what it is that writing means to incarcerated people. I'll be happy to talk about that, in the question and answer. But I wanted to start with this to suggest that writing is not just a matter of a kind of instrumental communication from the inside to the outside, but also it can be vital to what in inside knowledge, in witnessing the era of mass incarceration, I argue is the full status of a human being, is the capacity to communicate and to express their ideas. So my work in prison started at Attica, famously the site of the 1971 uprising, which I think is important to know is not simply an uprising, amid the turbulence of the 60s and early 70s, but very specifically a response to the profoundly inhumane conditions inside Attica. And for those days, journalists and policymakers, actually state officials, came in and negotiated with men, and famously, tragically, It ended on September 13th when Nelson Rockefeller, essentially working to bolster his law and order credentials so that he could make a political alliance with Richard Nixon, who, after the massacre, called and congratulated him on everything that he had done. And I put that image up. And by the way, this image is not of, it's a mix of people who are killed and people who are being piled up because people know about the uprising and know about the massacre, but they don't often know about the fact that for several days after, there was basically a period of torture. Outsiders were not allowed in. Men were abused there. And I put those images up as problematic as they are, simply to understand that this, it really looks like the images you see from war zones. At Attica, every year, there's a memorial for the officers who died. There's no recognition for the death of the incarcerated folks, who are the great majority. The massacre, of course, indiscriminately killed both the hostages that the men had taken and incarcerated people. So this is a map of Attica. The bottom left corner, building 17, is where I ran a writing workshop, as mentioned, for 10 years. This map cannot be introduced into prisons in New York State. One of the ways that prisons control people inside is through disorientation. Heather Ann Thompson, famously in her book, Blood in the Water, the most comprehensive history of the Attica Uprising, sued successfully to have the book introduced to New York State prisons, but the one thing that she could not have introduced were the maps. And I went in that, starting at number 1, you can see over on the left, through the various corridors coming around to building 17 for years, before I'd actually seen a map and actually realized where I was, in the facility. So disorientation is also, a common tactic in war, disinformation, misinformation, giving people bad leads. So the writing workshop that I ran, as mentioned, ran for 10 years. Men came and went in the group, but a core of about 7 men stayed on for many years. And this is just a sampling of their collective publication record. And as you can see, it's the top journals, top magazines, newspapers, literary journals, and one book that's come out. Another one is actually in press now. And I don't think that I just happen to run into, a remarkable group of people. They are a remarkable group of people. But I think more importantly is to understand that what I found was that if you could simply help people who are incarcerated to write clearly about their experience and also about the internal reflective process they were going through to essentially remake themselves after having committed violent crimes, the documents they would produce would be of enormous value to the world outside. And obviously this publication record, and again, it's just selective, suggests that. So I wanted to start an undergraduate course on American prison writing. There existed no broad sampling of nonfiction essays by currently incarcerated people. So with the help of a research assistant, we put out a call for essays, brought in 154 essays, and over the 3 years noted here. And that became Fourth City Essays from the Prison in America, Victoria mentioned. It's a thick, heavy textbook style book. And as mentioned, it's the largest such collection that exists. And it's called Fourth City, not simply because at the time, the prison and jail population was larger than the population of Houston, just behind Chicago's, but also because though there are around 5,000, depending on how you count them, more confinement facilities in the United States, the testimony that comes out of them is certainly more coherent than one would expect for of a survey of what's it like to live in LA or Chicago or New York, in large part because one dimension of freedom is the freedom to live differently, even in the same place, and that's not a freedom that's really much extended to incarcerated people. So of course, each of their stories is singular. So after the deadline passed in the fall of 2012, essays just kept coming and coming and coming. And that led, with the aid of a Mellon grant to a colleague at Hamilton College, to initiate digital humanities projects, created the American Prison Writing Archive. So one thing I really want to emphasize here is the archive was not built with any plan. I had no intentions of starting a digital archive. I wanted to put together a book that I could use in the classroom and that others could use simply to understand the experience of incarcerated people. And it was really the will and insistence of incarcerated people to write about their experience that built the archive. We have simply, created a platform and made that work sustainable over time. But it's really this is the work of incarcerated people, and ours is really, a matter of formatting and facilitating. Here's just a few stats. Currently up on the site, there are 3,862 essays by over 1,100 authors, 490 facilities represented, 49 states. And the estimated word count is now over 5 million words. And that was drawn together over a period from 2009 to the present. And then the way to think about this is that they're equivalent of over 54 volumes, the size of Fourth City, online, and we grow the intake varies month to month, but about 9.29 volumes per year are added. Another way to think about this, and not accidentally that I'm making this comparison, that we have 50% of the word count of all known North American slave narratives, or narratives by enslaved people. And within a predictable period of time, we will overpass that number. So there will be more first-person testimonies, the experience of mass incarceration, than there is currently that we know of to North American slave narratives. And that's just the counting in this archive. And of course, there are others as well, as I'm sure all of you know. Another remarkable fact about this is that for most of its life, the archive has solicited its work through a single quarter-page ad in Prison Legal News. Prison Legal News, for those who don't know, is a journal that covers legislation and court precedents that affect incarcerated people. It's known to be read closely by quote-unquote jailhouse lawyers. And yet that has brought in the remarkable amount of work that's come in here. Another thing that I want to note is that, and this is an argument made, and this panel is actually, or this page is actually taken from part of Witness in the Era of Mass Incarceration, is that I want to argue that the writing of incarcerated people is a true witness literature. And for the purposes of the book, I put up these criteria, and I won't read all of these in detail, but to say that a writer's work bears witness to a collective experience, that the experience is one suffered not by an individual, but by a whole collective group, legally sanctioned, and that the writer's testimony is irreplaceable. And as mentioned in these notes, but also you can see, pretty obviously that would apply to Holocaust narratives, slave narratives, the transcripts from Truth and Reconciliation tribunals, etc. And the aim is not simply to put together the archive, but also one of the things that we're focusing on, and we have Mellon money to support Mellon money supporting all of this work, is to actually put out a book series to put this work together in a focused kind of way. So as Victoria mentioned, the first is Inside Knowledge, and my book that came out in January focuses on the way in which prisons not only do not achieve their four cardinal rationales for being, but actively defeat them. And that's based on the testimony of over 200 writers in the archive. Another volume is actually right in progress, nearly in press. Harm and Punishment, Incarcerated Writers on Violence in the American Prison, guest edited by Elizabeth Hinton and Elsa Laura at Yale University. And we have in line agreements with Heather Ann Thompson to do a book of work from the archive focusing on conditions and resistance, and Michelle Alexander on the meaning of liberty, justice, and liberation for incarcerated people. All right, now I'm going to go back to my notes. I'm going to stop the share for a moment. So another thing that I want to really touch upon is the potential, and I've seen this in practice, of this work to move hearts and minds. And though I can talk to students and others about, what I think they might gain from reading the archive, what I found is that people simply enter into it. The archive, in some sense, teaches itself. It's metaphor I've given to students in the past is to say, imagine you're walking into a room that's completely blacked out. It's dark, it's full of furniture, and you have to figure out how to arrange the furniture in that room. You're going to do that after bruising your knees, right? And having a few encounters with those things before you can figure out the landscape. And what I find, and I found over the course of years, over 10 years now of teaching this work in classes where students are using the archive, is that they actually discover a much more granulated sense of what they consider right and wrong when they see and read the really gross wrongs that are being committed, in effect, in their name, in the name of public safety. And often they will come out and say that they feel like their moral compasses have been tuned, by that experience. So they've used in course evaluations terms like life-changing, I've opened my eyes, everyone should study this work, et cetera. And I don't attribute that to my teaching style or capacities. It's simply the work itself makes those changes. And I teach a course on, uh, it's called Literature as a Witness, and it's Holocaust narrative, slave narratives, and prison writing. And in the beginning of the class, students find this kind of outlandish that I would put those three on a continuum. By the end of the semester, there's really no quibbling about that at all, given the remarkable overlaps between the sentiments and the experiences of people in these three situations. Obviously, there are very obvious differences between these three folks who are suffering because of what they are rather than what they've done. But if we look at the demographics, and some of those were mentioned by Victoria, and the really brokenness of our criminal justice or criminal legal system work, those differences tend to flatten out a bit. I'm going to read a little bit from Inside Knowledge, a passage from the introduction. And there I say, one aim of the APWA is not only to present prison witness, but to stand as a warning. Recent changes in national mood, political rhetoric, and even statistics, however laudable, will not bar us from continuing on this path now or from resuming it in the future. And things have changed. When I started this work, it was a pretty hopeless landscape, but, things have changed. National attitudes have changed. The press is actually being much more conscientious in reporting the problems there. What might do so is a glimpse of the human faces behind the numbers. Imprisoned people's testimony is as compelling in its condemnation of incarceration as a practice of crime control as slave narratives were in condemning slavery as a machinery sold to the public as a civilizing force. At the end of the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration, the age of colorblindness, legal scholar Michelle Alexander writes, quote, isolated victories can be won, even a string of victories. But in the absence of a fundamental shift in public consciousness, the system as a whole will remain intact, unquote. In 2016, political scientist Marie Gottschalk seconded Alexander's conclusion and implied where that shift might begin. Quote, the slave narratives of the antebellum period, which graphically rendered the physical pain that slaves suffered and made it widely visible, helped to propel the abolitionist cause. Today, what happens in prison stays mostly in prison, making it harder to draw connections in the public mind between justice on the inside and justice on the outside. The ability to identify with an offender or not is a key predictor of why people differ in their levels of punitiveness. The invisibility of the millions of people behind bars has made it extremely difficult to alter the negative portrait that members of the general public have in their heads of people who have been convicted of a crime. They're simply prisoners and criminals. As such, they often are denied their humanity and any right to democratic accountability, much as slaves were in the United States, unquote. The testimony of enslaved and formerly enslaved people affected public awareness by actively countering Southern propaganda that presented the enslaved as the happy beneficiaries of paternal white masters. The APWA hopes to do for readers today what slave narratives did for readers before and after the Civil War, to allow us the chance to read from their own hands the testimony of a population wrapped in popular myths and lucrative misrepresentation, and bound by socially destructive policies and practices that pervert the ends of law and justice. My hope is that these writers effect what they clearly intend. Alexander's proposed, quote, fundamental shift in public consciousness, unquote, regarding an institution that has become both one of the nation's largest employers and a crucible for debates on public mores, law, race, and justice. And that's the end of the quote that I'm going to give you from the book. So what we're trying to imagine, and I've imagined from the beginning, is making prison writing, the writing of incarcerated people, not just accessible, but unavoidable, so that no claims made about public safety or about the people who are inside cannot be countered by widely disseminated prison witness. And prison witnesses, I think it's important to note, is that they've built an archive with the potential to transform public thinking and policy and practice at an even more granular levels than could narratives by enslaved people. First, there's the sheer numbers. There are 206 known North American slave narratives. There are over 1,100 authors in the archive. And of course, they come from all states because no state is immune from carceral practices. And as I often tell students, you know, there are many countries in the world that don't have democracy. They don't have free enterprise, but there are none without prisons. This has been the most successful institutional export from the United States in its history. I now want to go back to the slides and do this. Hope that's, whoops. Okay. And let me get over here. Oop. Let me get with this. There we go. Okay. All right. I teach a course called Curating Prison Witness. And what I'm showing you here is the curations, as I call them, simply from one semester, from the fall of 2023. Students are put into small groups. They work in teams, basically for a week or two, and they choose topics from a large, extensive index based on the index from Fort City, but also supplemented by comments from a number of formerly incarcerated people, you know, for areas that we feel like they were not covered in that index. And then they go through the archive and they pull out essays and excerpts that are relevant to particular areas of interest to them from that index. So they've written on writing to others, communication with the folks outside, queer lives in prison, prison hierarchies, prison as a business. That is to say, the understanding that this is really more about business than it is about justice, judicial misconduct, hygiene, food, sanitation, coping, food, healthcare for women, parenthood, remorse, touch, the physical contact with others in prison, long sentences, the death penalty, medical malpractice, cycles of imprisonment, medical neglect of women, outside connections, and loneliness. And in each of these, there are between 20 and 50 excerpts from the archive that are put together. There's a good bit of overlap. Essays, you know, rarely deal with just one topic exclusively. But the work these students have done, oops, hang on just a second. The work these students have done is adding to that index, which I hope to build out so that we have, in effect, a place where folks can go and quite quickly find essays on topics that they're particularly interested in, so that we're, for particularly for lay folks, who are not archivists, who may not have the search capacities that professionals do, to be able to understand exactly what's going on inside. One of the things becomes apparent, when you read deeply in the archive, is that the archive isn't just about life in prison and jails. People write about everything that led to where they are, their lives before incarceration, They write about poverty, dysfunctional homes, child protective services, foster care, gang involvement, mental illness, addiction, domestic violence, disability, hyperpolicing, and of course, courts, jails, and prisons. And what they're doing really is they're mapping from inside a full wide range of civil dysfunctions that many quote unquote experts and policymakers and government officials try to figure out, from the outside. But all these areas are really mapped from the inside. The prison itself is itself, of course, indexical of all of these other issues, a whole range of civic failures. Next, I also want to, and this is, of course, important, is cautions and caveats. Um, anyone who writes about their experience in incarceration is putting themselves at risk. This is an institution that was built, conceived of by Benjamin Rush in 1787 as a institution basically to censor the communication between incarcerated people and the world outside. There's a very explicit intention. And he proposes basically splitting the prison into two bodies. One is the body of the experience of incarcerated people, and the other is the public imagination of what those people are suffering. And that bifurcation, of course, continues today now at an exaggerated point, or much exacerbated point, with the layers of public and popular media that misrepresent incarcerated people and the incarcerated and carceral institutions. Incarcerated people also, I think this is a really important point. They're not stupid, right? They're not being locked up because of their mental deficits, though that can happen, certainly, because there's a lot of handicapped folks inside. But they're very savvy about what are the limits they can step up to and what's going beyond the line in terms of getting themselves into trouble. At the same time, there are a lot of folks who are quite indiscreet. They're just pissed off, right? They don't care what the consequences are. They need to get their stories out into the world. And at the same time that we have to be cautious about our incurring risk for incarcerated people as well as our projects from the outside. Another real danger, I believe, is actually becoming patronizing and deciding that these folks just don't know what's good for them. We need to decide, what can go out in the public sphere or not. And I compare that to, for example, a news agency that was, specializing in first-person witness from Gaza. These are folks who are trying to get the word out, to try to change conditions, to document those conditions, and to move policy and public opinion. It's a slow war, right? It's a more slow motion war than an active war zone. But I don't think the urgency felt by incarcerated people is actually any less. And here I'm going to share one more time, maybe two more times. Sorry, I have to keep doing this. I'm going to put up here, and I'm going to read them all to you. Just a couple of few samples from the archive to give you a sense of the kind of work that's there, the kind of desperation, really, that folks inside are often feeling when they write for the archive.
Hey, Doran, sorry
Yeah, I think I
to.
can change
Yeah,
that.
yeah, just a little off.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. So I'll just give you some time to read, and I'll go on to the next frame.
I think it's a little out of frame, actually. It might be helpful if you could read it for us, and then
Oh, okay.
anybody
Okay.
listening to this later can, yeah.
The first is prison is a place of lost souls, self-hatred, and saddest behavior. A place where men look like men, act like men, but aren't men. Prison is a place of evil reincarnated, human suffering, where everyone has a knife or razor blade and walk around with a chip on their shoulder. That's from Jamel Lamont Brown from New York. First, you are loaded from a bus, and shortly thereafter, the dehumanizing process begins. You're made to strip naked with 100 other inmates, sprayed with bug spray, and then placed in a shower on top of each other. After that, they strip you of your dignity by herding you naked down a long hall where hundreds of other inmates whistle and catcall at you. Lastly, they issue you an inmate number and a uniform identical to everyone else's, essentially stripping you of your identity. Once this is done, you are placed in a 6x8 cell with another inmate and a new kind of education begins. Quickly, you learn that only the strong survive. You have to be tough physically, but even tougher mentally. Mistakes can get you hurt, sometimes even killed. Those of us who are not violent swiftly learn it. If you are capable of feeling emotion, you eventually lose that ability. You can't afford to have it. Men become animal predators, preying on those who are considered weak. Principles are lost, values are rejected, morals become non-existent. And this is from Jamil Sykes from Missouri. Lately I feel like I'm suffocating. Each minute every day is a slow asphyxiation. The worst death sentence in this country is being buried alive in prison without hope. I know that in me there must be a human being beneath all this agony. It is a faith belief. That's John Russell Busset from Connecticut. Many of my trans sisters fall into the state of depression where they are pumped full of psychotropic drugs. Many adopt attitudes of self-destructive behavior. They fall victim to the whims of those who lurk in the shadows. They allow themselves to become wrapped in the arms of these defilers. They quietly become addicted to the false sense of security they feel from these vampire soul suckers. They become addicted to drugs, alcohol, and sex. They find themselves prostituting and turning tricks in order to either state their drug addiction appetites or to be able to eat and fall asleep with a full stomach, or simply satisfy their addiction to sex, which they mistakenly equate with love. Many have no one from outside the outside world to support them. Yet I also know that our voices need to be heard. And since I have this opportunity to do so, to not do it would be a travesty. No, I desire to shout from the mountaintop. I want to scream into the universe that yes, we do matter. And that's from Ebony Delaney in California. Okay. And this is our call. I'm putting up, can you see that? The call for essays?
Yes.
Okay. I put that up basically so people can screenshot that. If you want to submit work, if you work with incarcerated people, you want to get the word out, we always encourage people to do that if they possibly can. And I'll leave that for just a second and see. Maybe come back. Okay. So finally, after years of unethical, extractive use of information about and the creative work of marginalized people and populations, there's been a much needed period of correction broadly represented by the creation of IRBs, attention to informed consent, etc. These changes were crucial and necessary evolutions of the research and social justice landscape more generally. The impetus for these changes came from the notoriously abusive and dangerous practices of medical experimentation on incarcerated and other institutionalized people. On this point, I would strongly recommend Rothman's book called Strangers at the Bedside, about the transformation in attitudes about experimentation in the medical industry. Application of such rigor is necessarily more nuanced regarding the use of information and the creative work of these populations. But our conversations about the ethics and risk should not delay our work in facilitating the decensoring of incarcerated people's creative products. And I will stop there. All right. I'd like to open it up for questions and comments. I know there was a lot there, but I'm very happy to take any comments that you have. I got a lot of comments here in the chat.
Thank you, Doran. And some of them are me sharing information, trying to keep up with you in the chat, including that book you just mentioned. Do let me know if that's not the right one. We're going to open the floor to questions. We have a few in the chat already. And we are also, for this, for the first time explicitly, going to invite members from the Student Archivist Maryland group, who some of them are gathered together on campus for a watch party, and others of whom may be in the chat, to please either go ahead and unmute or share in the chat question. We're trying to center the voices of our students, particularly those on our Master of Library Information Science program. So I'll give you all a moment to gather your thoughts, and then we'll turn to questions in the chat.
So I'm going to take a very brief break here, and then I'll be right back.
Okay. So Team Sam, if you want to type your question into the chat, that's also great, and I can read it out if you prefer. While you're contemplating. And also do a little screen share for the moment. These are the new standards for library services for the incarcerated or detained, supported by the Mellon Foundation and the American Library Association. And I've pasted this info in our chat. We'd like a free copy of the standards if you're interested in or already taking part in this work. As serving information needs on the inside, then these standards are very much for you. Okay. I'll take a look at our chat and just go in the order that I see questions. So Cecilia asks, how receptive are prison officials to letting prisoners write, and how receptive were they to cooperating with the project?
I haven't really getting operated on the the old phrase that's easier to ask forgiveness than it is permission. So I've never contacted prison officials. The call for essays goes out. Incarcerated people write to us, because going through the protocols, I mean, I know what the answer would be from the prisons, right? They don't, I mean, these are institutions, as I mentioned, built to censor incarcerated people. We do on the website, and also rather in the permissions questionnaire that we send out, in which people write and give us permission to work our archive. We describe what it is. We also try to give them a sense, particularly for folks who have been in prison since before the internet was a thing, what it is to put their work up in a public venue like this. But other than that, we trust them. And then, of course, we read everything that comes in. And our default position is to put everything in if it's relevant to our mission. We're not selecting for literary quality, for particular subject matter, other than it's having something to do with their criminal legal system involvement.
Kashina asks, has the project had any discussions or plans to include content warnings for the website, since the project concerns many vulnerable populations that may be triggered by the archive's subject matter?
We have not. We have not. That may be a fault on our part. But again, we've tried to be, a venue for folks. I do deal with this, certainly in my teaching and a massive online course that I taught some years ago, to understand the difficulty of reading this work, because it can be very wearing. And this is something that our staff that do the frontline intake, I have to deal with as well. For my students, I say you're absolute permission to just not read this, for the week, if you need time off from doing what you're doing. But we don't want to be, a filter, if we can possibly, avoid that. That may be something that we revisit, but it's, that is our policy at this point.
Ben asks, do the individuals who write these stories share their experiences with resocialization, forced to take on new identities, so forced degradation ceremonies, etc., If so, have they expressed how they dealt with those challenges of taking on new involuntary identities? And then I think there may be a follow-on question from another person, but I'll pause there. So I think this the question is centered on people's experiences of violence, at the hands of other people that they're incarcerated with, which I think a couple of the quotes touched on. I don't know, Ben, if that's not what you were driving at, just let us know.
Yeah, for that question, yeah, there are a number of narratives there that I look at. In fact, that's one of the things that I focus on in the second chapter of Inside Knowledge, which looks at the way in which prisons actually defeat retribution. And incarcerated people often will write about the fact that they simply don't recognize themselves after a certain number of years in incarceration. So that in effect, the person is being punished, doesn't survive, right, inside, the conditions in which they're forced to live. And, pleas essentially, or not pleas, but documenting the loss of the sense of themselves, right? As one of the pieces that I put up, just saying, you can't afford to have emotions. So that process is well documented by folks inside. I hope that answers the question. And then there are stories also of people going through that process and then finding something that basically, turned the tide for them. And they found something, education, it can be a renewed contact with a child, religious conversion, etc., that gives them a sense of focus. And one of the things in the chapter that looks at the defeat of rehabilitation inside prisons is looking at the way in which rehabilitation does take place inside prisons, but it does so almost exclusively on the basis of the work of incarcerated people pushing, upstream against the institution itself, right? And one of the arguments it makes essentially is that prison has been a sham from the beginning. It's never done what it claimed to do. But because it has, divided this public idea of what it is and what it does from the actual practice, we basically conveniently bought the fact that it has some sort of socially constructive effect. And essentially it doesn't meet out retribution, but simply damage to incarcerated people, and they document that.
Yeah. I'm gonna get to some of our other questions. We've got a few more coming in. Thank you. And Ben follows up and says that more than answers my question. Thank you, Dr. Larson. Thank you, Ben. Evie or Evie, pardon me if I mispronounced your name, asks, what ethical consideration should guide the creation and dissemination of prison narratives to ensure the dignity and agency of those involved?
Certainly the agency is simply by making that work public as they hope to make it. In terms of the dignity, one of the things we're careful on at an earlier time, and we've been evolving over time, as I mentioned, this has grown simply with the impulse and the will of incarcerated people. So we've really been playing catch up, along the way as the archive has grown really rapidly. We used to include a lot of information in the survey. And we actually survey a lot of information, but we don't put very much information about writers up on the archive itself. Because even though they've agreed to have their information put out, it can feel a little prurient, right? To be looking at, too many of the decisions that they make, even if those are voluntary. And all of the information that makes up the metadata for the search facets in the archive, it's all voluntary. Someone can tell us nothing about themselves, and we will still post their work, right? If they do put it up, then people can make more granulated searches. One of the things that I've seen is that the posting of the work itself goes a long way in actually bolstering the dignity of incarcerated people. We've had many letters from folks saying, what it has meant to them to have their work in the public sphere. I'll never forget, an instance in which I got an email from a woman saying, I only have a few minutes here left on a computer station at a public library, but I wanted to let you know that my daughter just read an essay by her father, and thank you for, making this possible. So those kind of communications are facilitated, but more importantly, I think that, and I don't just think this, I mean, this is what writers are often expressing, is a sense that they have made, strides and given a sense of aim and focus in their lives, which are, willfully deprived by being able to put their work out into the public, right? You got the implication in one of the samples that I gave by Ebony Delaney is like, now that I had this opportunity, I really need to say, what it is that I'm saying here, right? I hope that
Um,
in some sense of answer the question.
yeah, so and I think there's a question from a student archivist Maryland student that connects with that, and it's about maybe people's reactions after they've left incarceration and they're in reentry. Or maybe that's a question that's also about others who were formerly incarcerated but didn't contribute to the archive. Has anybody come to visit the physical archive at Hopkins? And actually, I should just clarify, is the physical archive at Hopkins, or is it on, is Hopkins curate or supporting the digital space? Like, that's a distinction there.
Yeah, the archive is supported through the Sheridan Libraries at Johns Hopkins. And I should clarify, it started at Hamilton College where I teach. But Hamilton is a small 1,800 student teaching college. And it became apparent to me that, if I were hit by a bus, the archive would go away. So that's when I started looking for an
Oh,
R1 institution that are sort of wider.
is Doran frozen or am I frozen?
What's that? Oh, am I frozen? Uh-oh.
Oh dear. Okay. Oh, am I back?
I think so. Am I back?
Okay, I think I was the one who was frozen. Sorry.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if you got through anything else, but the last thing I heard anyway was that you uh thought Hamilton might not be able to accommodate the archive in the long term, and that was where I lost you.
Yeah. So that's why we're looking, that's when I started looking for an R1 institution to locate it. Veshla Weaver, who co-directs now, had been using the archive with her students at Yale. She's now at Johns Hopkins for some years. And so that became a natural location to move the archive. And the Mellon Foundation grant that we received enabled both the transfer to, or rather the transfer to Johns Hopkins, and also wider gathering and dissemination efforts. Um, Actually, I've forgotten what the first part of that question was there.
No, I think you've covered it, and there is I'm going to try to trot through the remaining ones. So we have a kind of related question there. How easy is it for people to review their own material once it's gone up online? And I think that may be a while incarcerated and post incarceration question.
Yeah, of course, the irony is that a digital archive, it's not very accessible inside. Period, is not accessible. We do put with every essay, every time you pull up an essay, you'll see at the bottom of the page our takedown policy, so that people have folks on the outside that can let us know that we want the piece, or they can write to us, right? Because most of our correspondence, of course, is snail mail. They can write to us and we can take down their piece, right? If they're, for example, people coming up for parole, right? I don't want the first search on my name to be, writing that I've done or the writing about X, Y, or Z, inside the institution. We are soon to launch a inside version. And of course, it doesn't have everything that's in the archive, that'd be 54 volumes. But basically essentially an inside newsletter that we'll distribute inside prisons.
Wonderful. I'm going to read out the two questions from my colleague, Katrina Fellman, former director of CAPTE. Such a powerful project. Thanks for sharing this with us. Has the archive gotten pushback, political or otherwise? If so, how do you deal with it? And she knows that managing risk is a core concern for many social justice archives.
We have not at all. And I think that's because our profile is not wide enough. I think we would welcome, getting the kind of profile that would give us pushback. But we have not so far. In fact, there was one instance in which the head of programming for a state prison system actually sent work to us, and wanted to get that, where he's a very progressive fellow in a docs program, a docs institution. But yeah, we have not had that at this point. We are, though, we're actually convening in October an in-person gathering of people who work in this area in general, archiving, preserving, and disseminating the creative products of incarcerated people. And that's going to be at Johns Hopkins, also funded by the Mellon Foundation, for that convening, basically to talk about the ethics and the logistics of doing this work. Because those are questions that we're sorting through, literally day by day, as new work comes in and new questions arise. And we're also, consulting with legal consultants to look at all of our materials, right, to better understand. And this is partly for the reassurance of the frontline readers, so that they know, how to respond when, something that's really problematic comes up. Naming people, giving the full names of people from whom we don't have permission, right, to post work, or naming staff, right, in the commission of crimes, because that is common inside prisons in the U.S.
I think that the second part of Katrina's question is maybe one I will leave you with, but I'll read it out here, but sounds actually super related to that next phase or ongoing phase of deliberation. How do you think about the future of the archive and its sustainability over time, or the preservation function implied by the word archive?
Yeah.
And
well, we have all the challenges that all digital archives have, right? We do retain, our policy now is to retain everything that we receive in physical form, in the standard, ways that libraries do preserve in archives. But at the same time, as mentioned, the work can be taken down, and we can return that work to incarcerated people if they contact us, right? As many of you probably know, every year in incarceration reduces one's life expectancy by 2 years. There's rampant suicide. A lot of people die of old age, of curable diseases. So we also have the problem of our contributors passing. And those are all issues that we're dealing with constantly, and trying to understand and sort out. Particularly since once someone leaves the system for whatever reason, whatever path, it's very difficult to contact them thereafter. All right.
So we're just past 5 o'clock. So I want to say, for those who do have to leave us, of course, we understand this recording is going to be made available in the coming weeks. And I'll just try to quickly encompass, I think, one last comment and question. Laura Carter says vicarious trauma is definitely real. She used to work for the DOC and managed grievances. Looking forward to sharing out the call for essays, and thank you. I think we have a few thank yous coming through in the chat. Thank you all for joining us. And I think there's just one more question from Brittany. Thank you for sharing your work. I'm curious what you think archivists, practitioners, students, scholars, and their roles as archivists can do outside of sharing this and other similar archives to support incarcerated people. Is there anything you would recommend for archivists to do to support people who want to do memory work while in jail or prison and after their release? I guess that's like a beyond this specific project.
For those of you who don't realize, prisons are remarkably open to people volunteering their time inside, essentially because they can count that as programming, right? And it doesn't cost them anything. So I would think about this as well as, looking at archives and getting word about our archive and others. Think about actually going to a local prison and, devising some sort of program that you could offer for incarcerated people. A writing class, an understanding of, I think it'd be difficult to do something on archives because there's no access, of course, and no digital access. But I've rarely met a person who was interested in doing this kind of work who didn't have some kind of skill that would be valuable and valued by incarcerated people. And my first recommendation on doing that is just get yourself inside and become the wallpaper, right? Prisons are machineries of routine. And when I ran the class at Attica, the only real question they had for me is like, when do you want to do it and how often? Because I had to fit into their schedule in some way. After that, they never asked what people were writing. I think because they so discount the capacities of incarcerated people that they can't imagine they're going to do anything that's of any value or of any importance, right? So that is actually something that I would recommend, right?
And I've put one link for a program we have contact with here on campus. It's the PD Green creative writing program and mentoring program in the DC jail. And the Goucher Prison Education Project is just up the road at the Jessup Men's Facility and the Maryland Women's Corrections Facility, which is not in Jessup, but it's nearer Baltimore.
Yeah, it's an important point. You don't have to invent a wheel. There are programs probably within a very, viable driving distance from you. Nobody lives far from a prison. There's just too many of them, to be terribly remote from them. And there are probably programs running there that could use your energies.
All right. Well, Doran, it just remains for us to thank you very much again for your work and for coming and speaking with us today. And I'm going to hang back in the room for a moment if anybody has any questions. But otherwise, folks reach out. Our next cafe event is going to be on October 2nd. It will also be a virtual event featuring Trevor Owens, and you can find out more on our cafe events page. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you all.